Hi, welcome to another Redwall review. And if it is not obvious already, today we will be discussing the tale of a wee bonny squirrel named Rakkety Tam. So, Rakkety Tam is the Redwall book with, well, a Scottish concept going on. The thing with this series is these books have many overlapping traits, the same species, the same plot dynamics, the same chronological setting, more or less, like every book's in a different generation, but they're all in medieval times. And the concept that tries to set this one apart is a focus on Scottish identity. Now, Redwall is not set in the human world, other than in the weird first book in which the world was underdeveloped and there was a reference to Portugal. Human countries do not exist in this series. Nonetheless, there are occasionally accents in the book that can be traceable back to human-inspired countries. And there have certainly been references to Scotland throughout the series with various Scottish eagles. We had a Scottish infirmary nurse, I believe, in the previous Redwall book. But this one comes the closest to specifically identifying characters as Scottish. The main character, Rakkety Tam, the squirrel on the front here, presumably named for the Tam O'Shanter hat and possibly for Rabbie Burns's famous poem, Tam O'Shanter, though I tried looking at that poem and his story is not at all the same as the squirrel. Tam O'Shanter was a bit of a wee rascal, he was, whereas Rakkety Tam is just a noble kind of Lancelot kind of figure in this book. That said, before each third of the novel, there is a little poem about Rakkety Tam. So I'm sure Brian Jiggs had Rabbie Burns and Tam O'Shanter in the back of his head. Now, as far as the developing of the Scottish world goes, there is specific description of Tam and his sidekick, another squirrel named Wild Dougie Plum, having three particulars: a long sword called a claymore, a long dagger called a dirk, and a tiny dagger called a sciendu. I think that's how it's pronounced. And there are references to Tam being from the borders and Wild Dougie Plum being from further in the north and thus having a broader accent. So whereas I guess Rakkety Tam is your sort of gallant Scottish hero, and kind of know a Ewan McGregor type, Wild Dougie Plum is more like groundskeeper Willie. He's a very competent warrior, but he has a very hot temper, which allows him to be used for comic relief purposes. This novel starts in a very strong way, in a way that doesn't feel like other Redwall books. Rakkety Tam and Dougie Plum have become the indentured servants of these squirrel monarchs, who on the one hand are written as villains. They're unjustly controlling these squirrel warriors for their own glory, but at the same time, they're so buffoonish that they aren't really treated as bad characters either. So Brian Jiggs kind of subverts his rules about having, certain creatures always be good and sort of doesn't. The other thing that makes this book very interesting right away, makes it a bit different than the others, is the main villain. You can sort of see him on the front. His name is Gulo the Savage, and he is a wolverine, a species we've never seen in the series before, and I don't believe we will see again. They're described as much bigger than the other villainous species in the series. I don't think that's biologically true. I don't think wolverines, bigger or would be like a different scale of thing than foxes. But then again, Brian Jiggs has kind of made foxes seem no scarier than rats over the course of this series, so he had to raise the stakes somehow. What sets Gulo the Savage apart from other vermin in the series is, unlike the various aristocrats and scoundrels who are just sort of sadistic and evil, Gulo the Savage is closer to being an outright monster in that, he actually eats the things he catches. And we have had predator type villains in the series before, namely we've had snakes. But I guess what makes Gulo a little bit unique is he's a hybrid between the sort of force of nature type evil that is the snakes and the charismatic, talking, hungry for power evil of the other kinds of villains. Now, does Gulo the Savage end up feeling that dramatically different than those villains? Not necessarily. Brian Jiggs is quite graphic for someone who writes for 8-year-olds, but this is not horror movie levels graphic, at least not quite. I mean, there's one pretty devastating scene in which Gulo has a rat prisoner, and we're kind of expecting that rat to be a major character because Brian Jiggs has kept using his name, but then he just suddenly turns on him and eats him. So I guess that's a pretty shocking moment. But basically, what I'd say with this book is, not unlike a lot of books in this series, I thought this way back with Matameo. At the very beginning, it feels like it's doing something very different. But as the novel moves along, it starts to just feel like any other Redwall book. One thing I would say about this one is I feel like in another medium, it could be very interesting, very distinct. If this was adapted into a movie, they would be able to make Gulo as unique and terrifying as possible. And I'm sure they'd also be able to play up the Scottish elements of Tam and Doogie Plum a little more. This one could also, I think, work very well as a short story. I mean, I think one reason these books end up all feeling so similar to each other is because Brian feels compelled to drag them out between 350 and 450 pages. Whereas lots of the time, if you just put together the unique elements, you might have some fairly unique tales. So I won't spoil it, but this book is based around a concept called the walking stone. And though it ends up being quite a small part of the book, uh, it is in a way what sets it apart. And if this had the pacing of a short story, it might pack a harder punch. So as the book progresses, for me, it gets a little weaker. So I know a lot of people like The Long Patrol, but that's one I really didn't like. And I think it's because it uses hare characters who, unlike the comic relief hares we got in the last couple books with Scarum and Horty, are just very posh, serious soldiers. And Brian Jiggs really likes naming as many of these soldiers. So there's Lance Jack Wildery, and there's Sergeant One Will, and Brigadier Crumshaw, and Corporal Butty Wapscott, and Sergeant Ferdinand Demain. And the problem to me is just they don't really feel like distinct personalities. There's a little moment where Ferdinand and Doogie Plum have a rivalry when they first meet. And I'm thinking, oh, this could be very interesting. This could be sort of the posh English versus the more rustic Scottish. Is this really going to be a fable about Scottish pride? But it's a Redwall book. Of course, it doesn't end up. And Ferdinand, stops being a bad character pretty quickly and just fades into the background as another supporting hare. Another thing that goes on is the vermin get to Redwall Abbey relatively quickly, as do the hares and Tam and Doogie Plum, which means there isn't the sort of adventure scenes that are in a lot of these books, and it jumps pretty quickly into battle. So again, like The Long Patrol, this feels like a fairly military-centric book. And while granted, a lot of people who read books about animals with swords might like that, when it gets too literal into the sort of military tactics stuff, that's when I like these books a bit less. There is a brief moment in this book where it looks like it's going to have a standard Redwall quest. We meet two Redwallers, a squirrel named Sister Armel and her otter friend Brookie. And Brookie feels like a character we've never seen before because she's not stupid. In some ways, she's very competent, but she has sort of like a pleasant, jokey naivety to her. So there's this great little confrontation she has with a snake that feels unlike anything else in the book. Now, unfortunately, Armel and Brookie get kidnapped pretty quickly and saved by Rakkety Tam, but in the brief moment when they were on an adventure, it felt like a really unique version of the Redwall traveling party. For once it wasn't just young ones quickly developing into warriors, it was a bit more awkward, it had a bit more potential for comedy. And honestly, though I don't think Brian intended for Armel and Brookie to be underplayed, I mean, they're mentioned prominently in the epilogue, I feel like I would have liked to see a bit more of them. Another character we meet around the middle of the book is Euphis Lightpaw. And this is another concept I like. So he is a vole and he is a thief. And he feels like a revisiting of the character of Gonth, who is a favorite from the second book. Mossflower reappeared in The Legend of Luke. And what frustrated me with Gonth is even though he's introduced as a thief, that doesn't make him an interesting or complicated character because he pretty much exclusively steals from the bad ones. He never has any problems getting along with the heroes. Euphis, by contrast, is a bit of an anti-hero. He does sometimes become selfish. He does sometimes steal from the good guys. He does sometimes sort of lose track of moral priorities and is a bit of a troublemaker, even as he's also ultimately a good guy and very lovable. I didn't always like the pacing of the Euphis plots and thought it was a bit arbitrary when the various deals he made were seen to be enforced. But I kind of like that Brian Jakes got the chance to revisit the Gonth character and this time bringing in a bit more moral complexity. And in fact, as the book moves along, there's a sort of side quest where Doogie and Euphis end up traveling together. And I think that really brings out the best in Doogie. Stereotype as it is, Doogie's angry Scotsman comes out more when he's paired with the frustration of working with Euphis rather than with his old fighting partner, Rakkety Tam, and he ends up being quite the comic relief. And I almost wish that Doogie himself was the main character because Rakkety Tam, as is often the case in sort of old-fashioned hero stories, is a relatively plain hero. So what else is there to say about this one? There continue to be some good comic moments, particularly with the fact that the villains are cannibalistic. One of my favorite scenes comes when Armel and Brookie, who are so sweet, are talking to a fox through the wall, and the fox is mouthing, "I want to eat you." And Armel's like, "You want to eat me?" So this book certainly has its funny moments. I feel like the book in its totality didn't fill me with joy. It didn't feel like a particularly impressive one in its overall tone in the way, say, Salamandastron did for me. But when I'm doing like a little summary video like this, I'm realizing, oh, there are a lot of really cool moments, a lot of distinct, memorable characters who get contributed to the Redwall lore in this way. So those are my thoughts on Rakkety Tam. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.